Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So it's been a while since I've done any watercolor painting in general, let alone doing it for a video. So I wanted to go back into a little bit of traditional art by doing some watercolor painting today. So hopefully I'm remembering this correctly. I am using the Baohong watercolor pad. So basically it's like a block, I guess it's a watercolor block. All four sides are pretty much all gummed except for like an inch of the center portion on one of the sides, so I can cut away the paper to become freed from the stack. But the reason why I like using this paper is because it prevents a lot of warping if you tend to use a lot of water, which you'll see me do a little bit later, and it really helps everything to dry flat. So I do like doing most of my watercolor painting, at least like ones that I want to keep flat or do larger pieces on this particular like Baohong kind of watercolor block. So while setting up, I realized that I wanted to keep my paper propped up still, so you can see how I usually focus my camera sometimes. So I have a sticky note that says focus so that I make sure that the text can be read clearly. So for the majority of our sketching process, because it is typically harder to see unless I zoom in really close to see any type of my sketches whenever I'm using the colored lead. And the light blue that I'm using for today's piece is the lightest that I own, so it does become very hard to see, but I'll show you guys like an overview at the very end of what the sketch actually looks like. And as you can see, like as we zoom in a little bit closer, it does become a little bit easier to see, but just not ideal. So I ended up speeding up the footage so we can kind of get through the sketching portion quite quickly. And kind of like, I apologize, I guess in advance, or I guess it might be a little bit too late. I ended up drawing my OC Selwin. So if you guys have not watched the last two videos from Saturday or last Wednesday, I ended up revamping and trying to make my ideal OC that I've always just wanted to have that kind of like fits all my boxes for aesthetic, I guess, purposes. So today is not exactly an exception. I did end up kind of more or less solidifying his color palette and his design from the last two videos. I am still, I guess like we're at 90% sure that I'm going to keep his color palette the way it is. So I ended up going with the blue and kind of burgundy and the cream colored cardigan is what I ended up going with. I did end up changing his eye color from that initial color palette that I gave him in that video. I gave him the eye color from the very first one that I wanted him to have, which initially it was supposed to be more like a blue gold-ish design and I guess like white, but because I changed it to be more of like that terracotta red color or orange color or brown, whatever you want to call it, I thought his eyes would need a little bit more of like that warmth in it too. So I ended up making it a little bit more sunset-ish colors, but you'll kind of see it a little bit more because once it dries and I ended up doing a little bit of different kind of layering for the eyes, it became more like, if you know Voyager's color scheme from Reverse 1999, his eyes kind of embody her color scheme, if anything. Or at least like that's how I found it when I was looking at it after it dried. But once the sketch was finished, I ended up going with my kneaded eraser and just lightly picking up some of the pigment so that it's not as harsh. Now I did do a bit of a mistake. I like to use the Pilot Color Eno usually when I do watercolor, especially for like a piece that I kind of want to finish up more or less or make it a little bit more rendered and just like fully painted, I guess is how I'm gonna describe it. Otherwise, if I'm using the Unidiacolor lead, which is what I ended up using today, and using it in my sketchbook, I like using it because it kind of holds up the color and doesn't really dissolve with the water, which becomes a problem a little bit later, as you can probably tell where I'm kind of going with this little story. So the Pilot Color Eno does dissolve with water and it's not light fast, so it does fade over time. If it's exposed to daylight or sunlight for a long period of time, it will fade and kind of like disappear more or less. I've already talked about that story a long time ago in my uni days. And then using it with water, it dissolves quite easily, and I usually like using the color red if I'm working with any character because it blends into the skin nicely or gets covered up quite easily when it's like some sort of like warmer tone, because a lot of skin tones just leans towards the warmer tone if there like has any flushing or anything like that. So it makes things look a little bit more natural. But because my character's colors were leaning more towards light blue, I thought it'd be a good idea to use light blue. But because I was using the Unida color instead of the Pilot color Eno, once we put down our initial wash of our paint and water, it actually doesn't dissolve. And me doing this wash over top of everything low-key kind of like locks everything in. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So after lightening up my sketch with the kneaded eraser and picking up at least a good portion of the blue lead color that I initially sketched with, I went to switch over to a normal HB mechanical pencil lead in 0.5 to do my actual clean lines. So I like to sketch a little bit more messy and freely whenever I use colored lead because it's going to be covered up by whatever medium, or if I do inking, I'll erase it in the end. It doesn't really matter. And just like, you know, playing around with the purpose of it will just depend on what you want to use it for. But with the graphite, it doesn't dissolve with water, and to keep my paper as clean as possible and having less of that graphite debris, I like doing it as just my clean lines at the very end, and hopefully it won't smudge too much with the water. But this is kind of the overview for our sketch for today of Selwin. Now, the funny thing is, as I was sketching here with the blue and doing my lines with the HB mechanical pencil, it does look very Ike. So once we get the colors, hopefully it'll look a little bit less like him, even though like I definitely pulled a lot of elements from Ike's design that I really liked for sure. A little bit from some other characters, but mostly probably Ike. But let's talk about supplies. So I own a lot of different brushes from doing like acrylic painting, oil painting, watercolor painting, and just like all that in general. So I picked out a few. I chose like my large 2-inch hockey brush, which is like the big one. And then I chose a size 12, I think a size 8. And then usually I use a size 6 and a size 5. So those ones I will use the most, like size 5 and size 6. And then I ended up choosing like a liner brush, but I don't actually end up using it because my size 6 brush and my size 5 brush, I usually have a good kind of tip on them and I can do the line art regardless. Okay, and at this point, I'm laying down my first wash, and when you start seeing me go a little bit more aggressively on the paper with the back and forth of doing the wash, I was trying to see whether or not the blue was actually going to budge from the paper, because this is when I realized that I used the wrong lead, and you can still see the blue over top of my little wash of like this golden-ish color. Now my wash became very, very faint, so I started to add a little bit more of like an orangey yellow because I wanted a very warm base to start off with Selwin, because in general I like the color blue a lot, and I wanted, like, you know, Selwin's main color to be blue. Like his eyes will have a little bit of it, he's gonna have like navy to ultramarine colored hair, and then his sweater is also going to be some sort of like blue-green or leaning towards like that ultramarine navy bluish color. But I wanted to play around with more of like the warmth, so I did end up trying to layer up more and more of that kind of golden yellowish color to give us a nice little undercoat base for our painting. So after I used the hockey brush to lay it down, I will wait for this to dry, but I was a little bit impatient. So I came back after I blow dried it with a hairdryer. And as you can see, my paper is completely flat, which is great. So we can actually start with the painting process. But with the close-up here, you can definitely see the blue lines are still peeking through. It does become a little bit less apparent in some of the areas because Selwyn's hair is quite dark. I feel like in his sweater-ish area, it blends in so you can't really see it. It becomes the most prominent in and around any area that has his skin tone. So like the face, the hands probably had the most areas that had the blue showing through, as well as his sweater, or like I guess his cardigan, because it's also on the lighter side, and I had some areas that were more or less like not touched by paint after doing the initial wash. So while I'm doing the painting, in terms of brushes, I used the hockey brush, which is like the 2-inch gigantic little brush. Little? Gigantic? Kind of big brush. to do our initial wash. And then I'm using the Raphael Kolinsky size 6. Now this brush has been really abused and beaten up for quite a long time, and because of that I like using it for like larger general washes. And whenever you see more of like a acrylic glass or like clear looking brush like the one I'm using right now, and it has the sharper tip, that's the one that came with the MeiLiang Watercolour Set, which is the watercolor set that I'm using for today. So I do switch between the brushes back and forth because the Raphael Kolinsky number 6 that I like to use and used to be my favorite brush has been used so much to the point where it no longer holds its point. I'm sure like you could retrain it, but because of how I mix colors sometimes aggressively, I think I've made the hairs to the point where they've been pushed outwards too much, so it really doesn't retain its shape. You can kind of see it on the right hand side of my page, so it's kind of like frayed. It looks a little bit bushy versus the brush that I'm currently using, which looks very smooth and has like a very nice sharp tip. So for coloring in general, I like to start with the face to get like a good base, as well as I don't mind if the skin tone bleeds throughout the entire piece, as long as I'm able to kind of like cover or incorporate it into the other surrounding areas. So Selwin has quite dark hair, so I knew it was going to be covered up anyways. And then I bled it in a little bit into his collar because I wanted it to have a little bit of that warmth. Oh, I forgot about this. So initially when I'm starting the band of his hair at the very top, I would like to do this all in one kind of go. So making sure that the paint remains wet for a good portion of the process. But as you can see, I'm trying to buff out these edges to see if they would budge, and they don't really budge too much, so I went in with a slightly darker wash to hopefully fix it out a little bit later. And the reason being is that I wanted to set a little bit of a gradient between his skin tone towards the hair so that any hair surrounding his face has a little bit of that warmth. But the reason why I ended up stopping so abruptly for that portion, also, if I don't move for a very long time during the time lapse, I'm trying to mix up like the correct color because I switch between what kind of color I want Selwyn's hair and sweater to be. So I'm going to flip-flop quite a bit. So I'm going to keep mixing up different blues. But back to the hair. I ended up taking a interrupted break, I guess, or like an unexpected break from doing the hair. And that's kind of like why it has that abrupt stop instead of allowing myself to paint right down to the tips of his bangs. And it's because there was a bee in my room. I talked about this a little bit on my stories, and you guys probably have known that I've been having a bee problem where I am. And it's specifically like I'm in the basement and like my office space is kind of in one of the rooms. And this, for some reason, there was too many bees. I think this is my 6th bee in general of like the last 7 days-ish. But I found one during the middle of painting, so I had to abruptly stop because it freaked me out. I feel like I'm triggered now by any buzzing. I always duck and like run, so that's what I ended up doing. I had to come back to pause the footage so I could locate the bee and see if I can, you know, lead it back outside. I caught 4, no, I did catch 6. I caught 6, or I guess I caught 5. My dad helped me catch the first one when I found out I had a bee in my room the first time. But geez, I just lost my train of thought. But in terms of the painting, so I kind of let the hair dry for Selwyn after doing kind of like an initial pass, and then we worked kind of like our way down towards his sweater. I let a little bit of those areas dry. We kind of go back and work on the flowers, and we kind of just hop around so that we can continuously paint and keep kind of more like efficient manner of painting by letting other areas dry, and we can work on different other areas so we don't accidentally run into any bleeding or putting your hand into the paint. But you can kind of see like my indecisiveness in terms of when I was doing the painting for his clothes especially. So when I was doing the sweater portion, which is like the inside dark bluish area, I was trying to see whether or not I should lean it to have a little bit more of like an emerald kind of undertone to it. So leaning it towards a darker tealish color, but I still want the shadows and stuff to be very blue. So I don't want to lean it towards too much of a greenish area, but kind of like typical me fashion, I love pairing up like blue greens with like yellowy reds or oranges or anything like that. So I ended up making his collar little tie thing around like the under portion of his collar as well as his pants, they were vastly different, even though I wanted them to be the same color, which should have been the terracotta color. But I wasn't too sure if I wanted to lean it more red or if I wanted to lean it towards more of like orangey gold. And because of that, I was a bit confused on how I wanted to treat his sweater color, because ideally it would be a color that matches nicely with that kind of like reddish terracotta or brick red, burnt sienna-ish color. I'm not too sure what I want to go with specifically, which is kind of like why I am 90% sold on his color palette. I just need to figure it out completely, then I can commit. And then later on, once we start to like play around and draw him a lot more, then I will kind of be a bit wishy-washy again when we start playing around with color, because lighting will change things, color temperature, all of that. So, you know, I just want to have like a base of where I want to start him at, and I'm still a little bit of flip-flopping between more orangey or more red. So yeah, and because of that, I either want to make his sweater more blue-green or more like blue-purple, or like blue-red, I guess, in that case. So I want to find a good balance. I think I am leaning slightly more of like an orangey red, so that we can have a slightly more blue-green-esque kind of color for his sweater, and then more of like a blue-purple or just like straight up more of a neutral-ish blue for his hair. Hopefully that kind of makes sense in some way. But after I ended up doing kind of like his base colors overall, I was still debating on a few things. I ended up starting to doing some like detailing, and you can kind of see me doing another kind of like green wash over everything to kind of shift it towards more of that green touch of like teal, because I think that's when I made up my mind. And after I did that, I ended up putting more of a slightly reddish purple color into his pants. I forgot to talk about this. So for my sketch, because I was so confused about some lines, I accidentally made his entire leg and thigh-ish area come all the way up, and it doesn't really make sense because the inside portion of his thigh that you can actually see should be covered by the sweater and his arm, because it should be overlapping. So other than that and his humongous hand, I like this painting a lot overall. Just ignore those parts and I think we're good. I think it doesn't help that more recently, well, as recent as it can be, considering that I haven't done watercolor in a while, I have been doing my sketches digitally and then transferring them to the watercolor paper by doing like that makeshift carbon paper method. And that way I can usually check if something looks completely off, which I didn't notice for a while, that his hand was like wildly too big. So I'm gonna try my best to kind of like cut down on it. I'm gonna mix like a darker blue and really chip into it so that at least we can buff it out just slightly. His fingers are still like, you know, too long, a little too wide, but we'll kind of like figure that out a little bit later. So our base colors, rough coloring, whatever you want to call it, is basically finished. I added the majority of like detailing and shadows to everything that I wanted, and then the last thing we have to do is doing our line art. So I think I'll show some parts a little bit later about this brush. So I don't know if I stored it incorrectly or it's getting to that stage where I accidentally beat it up too much when mixing colors. So I'm going to be wary in the future that I'm going to use the Raphael Kolinsky brush, the one that's been like really flattened, to kind of use that to mix colors. Because if you saw when I was doing the line art for the glasses just like a few seconds ago, it was getting thick for no reason. And the reason being is that my tip of this brush specifically has like a slight curve, literally for one strand of the brush. And I'm tempted to cut it, and I shouldn't, but because of that, when I lay down the brush, it lays down the curve horizontally. So if I drag in a straight line, it becomes really thick. And ideally, when I'm doing line art, I'm using just the tip of the brush, and I'm being very conscious about how it's being laid on the paper to get absolutely the thinnest lines as I can possibly get, as long as I have a good paint ratio and an okay pressure, I guess. But technically, none of that really matters if the brush is not going to cooperate. So On this eye, we did pretty okay, but working on the second eye, when I was doing his bottom lashes, specifically the lash at the very middle, I accidentally used the thicker end of where the curve was. So his lash towards like the center, I got more of like a big blob right away rather than like two thin lines to make up his lashes. So it was a bit frustrating, but I think I was able to turn my brush in a way that I could keep track of where that curve was and use it to my advantage if I'm doing like thicker areas or I want bolder lines. But otherwise, if I want those thin kind of like hairline-ish kind of texture or line work, then I have to be very conscious about actually looking where that tiny little curve is. I'm hoping that I reshaped it a little bit at the very end, so maybe when it's dried it won't have that stupid little curly cue at the very end. I'm very tempted to just cut it to see if that would help, but I'm scared that that tiny little hair was what's allowing me to do my thin lines, and I don't want to ruin this brush because I like it a lot. And I think I only have one other brush that I could potentially use for line art that would produce this kind of like finish line, if that makes any sense. I'm like very lazy when it comes to painting, so ideally if I could just use this one single brush for everything, I would have. But as you could see at the very beginning, I already knew that I would need my 2-inch hake brush to do like my initial wash of our yellowy golden color, and then I ended up using the I think I ended up using the size 10 or 12. It's like this really thick kind of, I think it's a squirrel hairbrush, I'm not too sure, or it's like a horsehair one. It's really mop-like, and it was great for adding the bigger washes, I think, to his cardigan as well as the bottom portion of his pants, because I was scared that the paint was going to dry too fast and I was going to be left with too many splotchy areas, which you can kind of see in the pants, but it's overall okay. Also, we're chipping away at the hand. I ended up using a really dark kind of like navy bluish color to add another shadow, and that way I could kind of like cut the hand. It also didn't really make sense for it to have that weird curve really, so it kind of works out in the very end. I also brought back the Raphael Kolinsky brush, which is like the size 6, and because it's very thick and kind of like mop-like at this point, I decided to quickly put in a little grid pattern into the background, and this is where I put my hand in the paint and immediately drag it down. Luckily, it was like 80% dry, so it didn't really smudge all the way down. Otherwise, it would have been really bad because it would have been a little bit harder for me to scrub and clean it out. And here I thought I was done, but I forgot. In his design, I really was debating whether or not I was going to give him like checkered pants or a pattern to his cardigan. So I went ahead and looked up some chunky cardigans, and there were some cute ones with like stripe patterns, and instead of giving him plaid specifically or a grid pattern, I decided to go with these little triple lines and then like a single line kind of going down, and that's the pattern I ended up using. Hopefully I'll remember to do this in the future, and we'll kind of play around with the patterning probably digitally whenever I do like an actual illustration of him digitally, because I don't know if I want to include it into his, I guess like the ribbing portion of the cardigan that's like on the main body part. For the sleeves, I ended up putting the navy blue, which I'm not sold on. I might put like a navy blue fixed stripe and then a thinner orange stripe or something. I'm not too sure, because like right now I think I am going to stick with this particular patterning for his overall cardigan, because I think it's cute that it's not like quite a grid and it's like irregular enough that I don't have to be too meticulous with like making a whole plaid pattern, I guess. Something gets really tedious with plaid, so I don't really want to make this character very hard for me to draw from time to time if they are supposed to be a character that's like aesthetically more up my alley and I want to draw him like quite a bit. So I hope you're not too sick of Selwin quite yet, but here's kind of like a close-up of our finished piece, and you can kind of see what my work area looks like. I think I showed you guys at like the studio workspace little tour that this is kind of like what my desk looks like, and I remove my little blue whale mat out of the way if I ever want to record anything with my iPad as well as using any traditional medium. So I just did a little bit of cleanup, but Selwin is finished. I think I am gonna lean his sweater to almost like that emerald-ish greenish blue color as like a slight undertone, just like slapping it in there every so often. And then his hair is going to be most mostly navy blue. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's drawing, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!